Welcome back.
Welcome to Decision Space, the only show to take place right here in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions in games.
And today, for the first time ever on this podcast, we are doing a review of a game that is not yet released. It's a full-on game preview and a very exciting one at that. It is a brand new Knizia game coming out, I guess, in 2025 by Bitewing Games, and it's called Ego, Extraterrestrial Greetings Organization.
Yeah, and it is brand new, but it's also inspired by something not brand new. So we'll talk about that in the show, which is very exciting. And I'm excited to be talking about a Knizia game, one that is hitherto unreleased, one that has pretty gorgeous presentation, and one that my wife said is the silliest game she's played in a while. But we'll see if Jake and I think that.
I think that's fair. I think that.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I killed your
my
hook.
lead-in?
Yeah.
It was supposed to be a callback.
Dang
But
it.
that's okay.
Okay.
We'll find other things to call back to. We got this.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, before we get into the meat of this episode, one thing we like to do whenever we get a review for this podcast, we like to read it out, and we just got a fantastic one from Adrenaline Junkie 68 on Apple Podcasts, Australia.
One of the best gaming podcasts going around. And this is from, as Jake said, Adrenaline Junkie. Dang it. I really enjoy these guys. They provide an extra layer of analysis to their chosen topics, but don't take their content or themselves too seriously. Episodes are obviously well researched and prepared, yet a relaxed and conversational tone makes for easy listening. Decision Space is right up there on my short list of favorite podcasts. Best wishes from Perth, Western Australia. So we always review. I'm going to give this 5 out of 5 stars.
10 out of 10.
Thank you, Adrenaline Junkie.
Except for one nitpick is he spelled favorite wrong. Favourite. So
yeah, Jake is also struggling with vowels today. But you can't win them all. Thank you for leaving a review. We would love for anyone who makes it to the end of this episode to also leave a review of our show if you have not yet done it. Helps so much with getting Decision Space in front of more people, which we appreciate greatly. Jake, you had mentioned this is really a first for Decision Space ever. We have never, up to this moment, this date, recorded a Kickstarter preview of a game that hasn't released. So this is maybe for longtime Decision Space listeners going to feel really familiar, but also a little bit different.
Right. We're trying to use the same format that we always use of sort of going through the game history, talking about the decision space in the game, of course. However, with the big difference that we had limited time with this game, usually we always try and cover games that to play games that we cover on this podcast, upwards of 10, 12, 14 times, sometimes many, many more than that, so that we can really give
sometimes more stupid numbers, like over 100 times.
So that we can really give a more nuanced understanding of, how the game plays and the types of decisions you'll be faced when you play this game. But in this case, we got this game last month. I was able to play it a couple of times, twice exactly, both at 4-player count, and then I had to send it off across the country to Brendan. And Brendan, how much have you played this game, and when? I should ask.
I received this in the mail, went on a trip, and have played it once. And I finished my game. It's coming out hot about 15 minutes ago. So I'm really excited to talk about it. And I played it at 2 players. My wife, Maya, and I played it together. And Ego is a 2 to 5 player game.
Cool. Yeah. So I think that's actually perfect.
Yeah.
Because we'll kind of have a good range of experiences. A lot of people play games primarily at 2. So I think covering that is really important. And then also, just for our own history of this game, it's a re-implementation of Beowulf the Legend. That's one I have played and Brendan has not. So we're also going to be kind of coming at this re-implementation from 2 different perspectives there as well. The other piece of the preview episode, we just want to disclose completely, this was a review copy sent from the publisher to us with the express intent that we would be creating this podcast episode based on the game that we agreed to. No money changed hands or anything, but
It was a review copy
It was a review
provided
copy, and
by Bitewing Games. Yep.
that's a first for us. So we want to make sure that we're shooting straight with our audience.
On Decision Space, we also always do a rating and review at the beginning of the show. We find that giving a sort of numerical rating to our game is important context, but really not the point of Decision Space. We want you to know how we feel about the game, so you have context for the discussion that follows. But we don't think it's why our audience listens. And today, because it's a preview, we're going to be using a special scale. Normally, we do the BGG 1 through 10, but today we've upgraded, side graded. We've swapped grading scales to the Solomon scale. Jake, what's the Solomon scale?
Named for friend of the show, Paul Solomon, who always likes to rate games on a scale of 1 to 3. 1 bad, 2 okay, and 3 good. And just cuts out a lot of the kind of noise that often comes up in these ratings. So that's what we're going to go with for this preview episode. Maybe it's a tool we'll use again on this podcast when we have less experience with the game to really feel like we can give it a full, for a 10-point scale to really be meaningful in any way at all. Do you want to give your quick rating and review first, Brendan?
Yeah, absolutely. So Ego is a unique game. There is no doubt about that. It feels like Knizia sort of greatest hits in terms of the mechanisms in a way. It's a little bit of an auction game. You've got some press your luck going on, resource management, and it's zany in a way that isn't difficult to parse, learn, or understand, but zany in the sense that the game arc and game structure is not something that I've ever seen before. And somehow, in a way, doesn't really feel, I wouldn't say it feels innovative or fresh, but it comes together, right? Like once you've parsed it, it's there. Eco, I would say, is a game that I really enjoyed my play of. It's a game I would like to play more. And I would need more plays to know if I enjoyed my play because it was interesting and neat, or because it was sort of a fun, quick experience that I would like to go back to. I don't think anyone should be signing up to sort of own or bring Ego into their collection if they're looking for a really deep strategy game. But Ego is interesting, and even in my one play had sort of fun moments that I would say reached kind of exciting highs that other games I've played maybe don't peak as high. But there's a lot of randomness in this game and uncertainty. And the decision space is also maybe a little bit narrow, but it's still, I think it's a 3. It's cool. It's a good game. It's neat.
Awesome. Okay, so it's a 3 from
really
Brendan.
between 2 and 3. Really between 2
you
and 3.
can't do that. It's not allowed. So you have to. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. Yeah.
I can't do a 2.5. Paul's gonna.
No, absolutely not. That's actually quite offensive that you would
didn't do it.
That.
Or did I? I don't know.
Yeah, we're bleeping all of that.
Oh no.
Okay, and for me, I'm gonna give it a 3 as well. I think this game, Ego, is like a game for people who want like a memorable experience more so than like a nice time. If Cascadia is like every time I'm playing it feels nice, I'm doing the same thing and it's like I'm getting rewarded, it's just like nice, pleasant. This is kind of on the opposite side of the coin in my opinion, where it's like you're gonna have really fun moments, you're gonna have exciting moments in every play. You're also going to like want to tear your hair out at times and perhaps feel quite upset or even pissed over the course of a play of Ego. So if you're somebody who you come to a game, you do terrible, somebody stabbed you in the back and you're like, can smile and say like, that was a great experience, I'm glad I had that experience, even though it went poorly for me, then this is going to be like your cup of tea. But if that's not what you like, if you want to just like relax with a game and be guaranteed to have kind of a fun time, pleasant time with your friends or family, then I think this one is kind of a steer clear. Though it is toned down much from its predecessor. But for me, I had a great time with these 2 plays. I want to play it more. I was excited to show it to 2 different groups of friends. So yeah, that's enough for a 3 for me. 2 fun plays.
Is this a party strategy game, if such a thing exists?
It's funny because it's like, it is. We'll talk more about the decision space later, but one game that I feel like it's kind of similar to in some ways, not from like a mechanisms perspective, but from like a gameplay experience perspective, is Zuvadis, another game by Bitewing Games. One I like a lot less than this because that one feels like even less mechanically driven.
And okay, I have to stand for Zuvadas. One I like even more than Ego. I think
Okay.
Zuvadas is a masterpiece. Jake's like, quit talking about Zuvadas on this episode.
Does that speak to what you're saying about kind of like a strategy party game? Because I think Zuvadis is that.
I think so. I feel like I have even more agency in Zuvadas than Ego. But I think what I mean is that the Ego exists with the dressings of a strategy game, but I think wants to be treated with a little bit less of the sort of incisive hard thinking that you might get from a more earnest strategy game. It's a game for people who, when they're in a room where there's a button, you just have to push it. Like if you're the kind of person who can see a button that you're not going to push, I'm not sure you're going to love Ego. But if you like to see a button and push the button, which I do, I think this game has great appeal. It's fun. This is a see what happens game, right?
I think I disagree a bit.
Okay, great.
Like when I played the game, I felt like hard decisions. Like there were definite moments where like I don't know if I should bid here or back out. Like that's
Interesting.
happening a lot. Where in Zuvadis, I feel much more like yeah, whatever. Like here's my
Uh,
take this right now. Like I'm wheeling and dealing. Um, and that feels less like decision driven than this game in a way.
this is perfect. We're going to come back to this discussion after our game background. We're just going to get right into the conflict on the back end, I think. Right?
All
This is
right.
good.
Yeah,
We're
perfect.
priming the conversation. Okay.
Game background. So we always like to talk a little bit about the game background, where this game came from. So of course, this is designed by Reiner Knizia and put out by Bitewing Games. Um, I guess we'll start with Bitewing Games real quick. They're sort of I would say like a up and coming publisher. They've had some pretty big hits, Zuvadis being one of them. They had a really successful campaign recently with Cascadero and Cascadito. All of those games, importantly, have been also designed and by Knizia in collaboration with Bitewing Games. So that's kind of like the lane that they're sitting in. They have other games by other designers, but really most of their output and is these collaborations with Reiner Knizia. And I think the owners of the company, the publishers, they're dentists, big Reiner Knizia enthusiasts. They run the Reiner Knizia enthusiast Discord, and kind of started this company, I think, in large part to make game create these games by Reiner Knizia, and they do a really good job, I think, in kind of putting Knizia games that are always so mechanically sound in like kind of theming them up in like a fun way that maybe has more mass market appeal than some of the dusty old boxes that they're re-implementing.
Yeah, they have done games outside of Knizia in some cases, right? There's Trailblazers, the Ryan Courtney game, that is kind of a pathlaying game. Ryan Courtney's, of course, the designer who did Pipeline. So that's there. There
There
are
are
games beyond Knizia in their catalog, and they have
definitely.
stark visual design that I think for me is a huge part of the appeal of Bitewing Games. I always like looking at games Bitewing is publishing because they are visually engaging in a way that I can't consistently rely on other games in the collection, especially with the color design. I feel like they're doing things with the color palettes of their games that just make them stand out a little bit and feel sort of a piece, but fitting of the theme. And that's definitely here in Ego.
Yeah, awesome. And then the other piece of that, the history here is that it's a re-implementation of Beowulf the Legend. So Beowulf the Legend is a 2005 Reiner Knizia game. It's sitting at overall on Board Game Geek 3,163 with a rating of 6.4. And I think the main thing, this is kind of like it's only a game that people who are like really deep in the board game hobby would know of, but of the people that know it, it has kind of like a mythological sort of status, pun not intended, where it's like a Beowulf themed game where you play out the story of Beowulf, and it's really polarizing for a couple of reasons. The mechanics are incredibly polarizing. We'll get into more of that later. Also, the theme is polarizing, where people are in two camps, where they're either say this game is like incredibly thematic because you play through the whole epic, including like minor and major story beats. And then other people are like, what are you talking about? This is just auction game. We're just doing a bunch of auctions. How can that be thematic of like the Beowulf epic? And then on top of that, it has like the most hilarious board that you've ever seen in your life, where it's like a square board, classic cardboard. So you got like the four leaves of it.
Hmm.
So it can fold twice, except for one of the leaves is missing. So you have like
An L.
an L-shaped board.
Yeah.
Um, and what I've heard, and I cannot verify this, is that like they were planning an expansion, so they were just gonna like pop a chunk in there, but the
What?
game did poorly, and that never came to light. So it was left
Wow.
forever as just like this incomplete L-shaped board. Um, Very funny in my opinion.
Wow. And such a cool idea that did not come to fruition. And here, an ego is redesigned to in a really cool way that kind of makes the board variable, which it was not in Beowulf the Legend,
Yeah,
but then also gets rid of this L nonsense and just gives you some nice boards that you can lay out on your table.
yeah, we'll get into very shortly some of like the big changes here, but they're like re-implementations come in like different flavors.
Yeah.
Some are basically not changed at all. Some have small tweaks. This feels like a major tweak.
Jake, for context, you have played Beowulf the Legend. Can you also give your thoughts on your experience playing Beowulf the Legend? Just because I think that's important context in addition to the previous rating here.
Yeah. Um I am
Deep breath.
I wonder if my like gaming groups would agree with this, but in my head I'm like a pretty even keel guy. And like when I played Beowulf the Legend, like I got actually mad. Like I was like upset. Like, my I was getting like flooded with like kind of like adrenaline, like almost like I was in like a fight with my spouse or whatever.
Yeah.
Like that was like the feeling I had because I was like so pissed off about what was happening over the course of this game. And hey, that's cool in the sense that like that was a memorable experience, but it was also like not an experience I necessarily like wanted to have again. And maybe afterwards I came on here, it's like that was cool. I probably would check it out again, but then just like never did because that's still like lived
Mm,
like the
yeah.
frustration and stress of Beowulf the Legend is still living in my body. And that's largely due to how the risk mechanism works, which we'll talk about here. We'll explain how they changed it and softened it in this new version. But I had to laugh because as I was doing the research for this episode, one of the reviews on Board Game Geek for Beowulf the Legend from Fast Fingers 18 years ago is just titled Good Family Game. I disagree.
That's awesome.
But yeah, okay. So why don't we actually, Brendan, go now into
Rules
an
overview?
overview of the rules, and then I'll kind of share more about like the big changes between these two versions. So normally we record this previously. This time we're doing something different. Brendan's going to give it his best shot to give an overview of the rules of this game live and just the gist, not every single rule, of course.
Yes. So Ego is a 2 to 5 player resource management auction press your luck game, more or less. Those are flavors that all combine into the unique game that is Ego. But essentially, players are moving together on a ship through these 5 boards, and the ship is going to depict different things that will occur, different events. And these events might be options that you can trade resources that you've collected for different resources. So you're collecting things like success tokens that are endgame victory points, credits that you can trade in for better things. You'll also get these offense tokens that you don't want. You desperately do not want these because you will have offended the extraterrestrials who you are attempting to greet, and those could end up being negative points at the end of the game. And also, you have a hand of tactics cards that show these 4 different suits that represent gift giving or persuasion or intrigue or technology exchange with these different extraterrestrials. And throughout the course of the game, you're going to be collecting these hands of cards that you will use at negotiation events that occur, in which all players sort of simultaneously are going to be, not necessarily simultaneously, there's one version of this where you actually do reveal simultaneously, and there's another that is a sort of around the table clockwise auction, more or less, where you are adding cards of these suits depicted in that specific negotiation, basically to be the last player who has not passed. But anyway, you're going to do this auction, revealing these tactics cards. You always want to win them. typically to get good things, maybe to avoid bad things, and you get a choice of them at the end. While you're doing this, you have the potential to take a risk. And to do that, you're going to flip a certain number of cards from the deck. And then if they match the cards that you're trying to reveal, the suit of cards that you're trying to reveal for that negotiation, you just get to use them in place of cards from your hand. If the you match perfectly, great. That was awesome. Your risk was this wild success, and that feels amazing. And you could do this every time it would be your turn to bid in this sort of around the table auction. You could just start by taking a risk. If you match some of the suits, but not all of them, you will add the cards that do match to the cards that you're putting out there in the negotiation sort of bidding. You'll discard the other ones, and then you'll take a penalty, a downside, which could be those offense tokens. It could be losing credits. There's a variety of things. And if none of them match, you just embarrass yourself, and there's no penalty at all. You don't get the offense tokens, you don't get the cards, but you are immediately out of the negotiation. And that's sort of that. You play the game going through these different events, having these negotiations as you go, collecting resources, trying to manage these offense tokens. At the end of the game, you get to trade in a lot of your potential leftover resources. So there's this light flavor of set collection as you go and are sort of planning your path through the game. Maybe you're trying to collect credits, maybe you're focused on other things. There's also a wild suit, so you're really managing there's real hand management considerations. And after you play through these 5 different boards depicting all these events, the player with the most points is crowned the victor. How'd I do, Jake? Decent live?
Awesome.
Okay.
I think you did a
What'd I
great
miss?
job. Yeah. I don't think you missed anything specifically. I think like the key takeaways, you've got a series of events. Most of the big events involve auctions. There's going around the table auctions, and there can also be simultaneous reveal auctions.
The other events are basically get more stuff or trade your stuff for other stuff, are basically the flavors the events come in. Yeah, it's those 3 things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so you're spending cards throughout
Yeah.
the game on the auction. So there are like times when the game's like, here, have some more cards. Basically just like restocking you so that you can continue to play the game. Cool. So hopefully that gives you a better sense of how this game plays. And we'll continue talking about rules as we have this discussion. And I think we should turn to like some of the biggest changes between the 2 versions of the game. And the first one you alluded to, Brendan, already, which is that the board in Beowulf the Legend is stagnant, and it's I mentioned it's like funny looking. It's also funny because it's like the board looks like kind of a snakes and ladders board where you're just trying to get to the end of the board. That's not really how it plays because you're like, but it tells you exactly the sequence of events that you will always take, always exactly in this order in every single game of Beowulf the Legend. And that's been substituted out for like these planet boards. So I think there are 5 in the game. There might be 6,
but you always start with the same one and end with the same one. So it's really 4 that you're shuffling, and you're picking 3 from.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. So you're removing one and putting those in a random order. So that gives you some like important variability, I think, to like and it feels important like for how the puzzle of the game unfolds. So it's still the same thing, like, right? Instead of like reading like Chutes and Ladders or whatever, it reads more like a comic book to me, where you're like going to the different panels. You're still doing the story in the exact sequence that was laid out at the beginning. That can never change. But it is like that just feels like
it's important.
Only for the good, right? Like this is just the modernized version of how like this type of like sequence of events game would go in 2024 instead of 2025 instead of 2005.
Yeah. Players move through the boards completely together. You are a ship that is moving all along. I think you're ambassadors together. So really the game arc and the feel of the game can shift. There's this Sinister board that I played with. That's the board with all the downsides. I think when that comes is going to be important to the feel of the game and sort of how you approach the negotiation event that comes there. And different. This is really a resource management game at its core. You're managing these offense tokens. You're managing a hand of cards, and then you're potentially managing collecting credits or collecting success tokens that you can trade in, or these alliance tokens. So because these different boards give you different resources at different times, it shapes that resource management puzzle in a way that I think would absolutely increase the replayability, right? Like
Yeah.
just strictly.
Definitely. I think
Yeah,
this is like, I think you'd be
it's
hard
great.
pressed to find somebody who
I
prefers like
really wish it was
always.
static.
Yeah, like if only we couldn't mix these boards up in any order we wanted.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, that's for like the real sickos out there. Just
Yeah.
like, yeah, I just glued mine together. It's better
Yeah.
this way. I found the optimal way.
Right.
Okay, so another way it's different is there's like in the original game Beowulf the Legend, there's a scratch and wound system, and that's been turned into this offense token system. So the way it works in Beowulf the Legend is like you when in some of these auctions, right? Some of the outcomes can be bad. Even if you're not on the sinister world, sometimes you would be, and this probably comes up more at like 4 and 5 players than 2 players, I would imagine. But the top reward, whoever stays in the auction longest and wins, is going to get a good benefit. But the person who went out first might take a penalty. So you can so that's the same in both versions of this game. So sometimes you, by just doing poorly in an auction, or choosing to conserve your resources now, you could get a scratch um, in Beowulf the Legend, or even a wound. And the way it works is if you get 3 scratches, those can be healed through some events. But once you get 3 scratches, you get 1 wound, and those can never be healed. And then at the end of the game, if you have 3 or more wounds, you must deduct 5 points for each wound. So if you have 4 wounds, you get like minus 20 points, and you're just like done. The game also offers, hilariously enough, variant, an expert variant, where if you have 3 wounds, you just die.
I love it. Yeah.
um,
I will
so
say
that's
in
pretty
the game
funny.
of Ego, I just played it. If I played Beowulf, I died.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
they come more fast and loose, I would say, right?
In Ego, yeah.
So the big change in Ego from this system is that like there's only one thing. It's this offense token. They look like angry babies. And you don't want to get them, but like they don't, like there's a way wider range of outcomes with it. So like getting 0, you get a bunch of positive points. You do get 5 points, I think, in Beowulf the Legend if you have 0 wounds. But here you get a bunch of positive points if you have 0, some positive for like 1, 2, 3.
Here, let me. Yeah, 0 you get 20 points. 1 you get 10 points. 2 you get 5. 3 you get 3. Right, so we're decreasing pretty dramatically. 5 you get 1, and then once you pass 5, 6 is just -2. I'm going to skip some. 8 is -10. 10 is -30, and if you have 11 or more, -40 points. So effectively,
You're
done.
done
So
for
yeah.
sure. It's funny, like when you play this game, you're like, okay, well, I'll just take 1 wound. That's no big deal. Wait, that's like minus 15 points, like right there. But there are ways to heal them and get rid of them too. I think, which also feels easier. Like there's more opportunities to do that in this game. So I think like it just makes getting these bad outcomes soften, because like that range of outcomes is so much wider. And like when you're in the middle of that bell curve, it's like, okay, like I could take this and lose like a point or 2, and it's like not that bad, versus like the same thing happening in Beowulf the Legend, and it's like the difference between like 0 and 15 points or whatever.
I think that a cool thing about this mechanism, Jake, and the way that it is implemented in Ego, is to me this feels like a slippery slope mechanism, like you just described, right? Like, oh, it's just one, right? Knizia is sort of saying he's playing with the player psychology, which he's actually really good at. I think that's why his games are so good, especially his interactive games. And most of his games are pretty interactive. Some, like My City, aren't super, but Ego is. It's about thinking about what the other players might do. There's even simultaneous choices for some of the events. And the slippery slope mechanism is great because it gives you that moment at some point where you're like, oh no. And I think that with Beowulf, it's less of a slippery slope and more of a cliff you push yourself off. And I think that it's more fun to have a slippery slope mechanism where you don't exactly know the point where you're doomed until you're doomed. Whereas in Beowulf, right, like the point is always you kick yourself off the cliff and you've lost, probably, right? It's kind of the difference in the incentive curves. And this is cool. I felt it. I slipped and I fell very far. And it was you know, a fun game experience in quotes, but it was fun because it
Yeah.
showed me my hubris.
It's interesting because as we're talking about this mechanism and this change, it's like maybe the impact is like the actually kind of the same, right? Like
Yeah.
if you get 9 offense tokens, that's equivalent to 3 wounds, and you're probably not going to win the game in the same way you're not going to win the game in Beowulf. But like the fact that like I getting your 9th token means your 9th wound means that like all of a sudden like in kind of the middle and late game you're going from no negatives to like all to like basically being eliminated from the game at like one moment makes it feel a lot more painful, I think, than right like having that like slowly accrue over the course of the game. So it like it doesn't so maybe it doesn't actually change the decision space in the way that it seems, but it does change like the psychology and the experience of playing again, softening. um and that's kind of be the theme here, right, of like softening Beowulf the Legend, which had these like incredibly polarizing mechanics, this being a piece of that uh polarization.
And then another key piece of that polarization is this risk mechanism,
This
right?
is like the piece.
So this is what makes it a press your luck game. So there are certain events that are just take a risk or don't take a risk. It's an optional risk you can take. And these are opportunities to refill your hand of cards that could help you a lot. It could be a boon, and it could hurt you quite a bit, potentially. Or it could just sort of be a missed opportunity. And that's how it's sort of set up in Ego. Because say you'll get to one of these risks and it will say, flip 4 cards, and it will show you icons that you're trying to match on those cards from the 4 suits plus 1 wild suit. If you match all the cards you flip, hooray, you get to add them all to your hand. That's rare, but feels great. But again, fairly rare. If you flip and some of them match, then you get to add those to your hand. You have to discard the others, and then you take the penalty. That's if you get 1 card that matches out of 4 or 3 cards that match out of the 4. You still do that. You still discard the ones that don't match, and you get the penalty. If you flip no cards that match, and this includes the wild, so no wilds and no matching the 2 symbols that are shown, then you get only the penalty. Then you get nothing bad. No penalty, no cards. You're just done, right? So I've said
Yeah.
that rule once, but I'm emphasizing it again because it's sort of quirky.
This is like the major change here in Ego versus Beowulf the Legend, because like this is in some ways like the hook of the game, right? This is what makes it not just like a normal sort of auction, right? This is like the twist on the auction format.
And because and we have to say why. Because it's not just at those risk events that you can do that, but also at those negotiation events where you're trying to raise how
Right.
many cards you get out. And you can, at the start of your turn, instead of playing cards from your hand, you could just take a risk. You could play cards from the top of the deck, blackjack style, and hope you get more.
And these negotiation events are like the core auctions, right? Doing well
Yep.
in these negotiation events means you've done well in the game, and
Yep.
doing poorly in them means you've done poorly in the game. Like this, everything else, like right, the other kind of like standalone risk events or getting cards is just to set yourself up to do well in these negotiation events. And like the cool thing about this mechanism is like it's never not exciting, and I love that like sometimes if like you're flipping 4 and you're like miss, now you're like praying that you miss because you
Missed.
don't want to get a single card and an offense token. Like you would much rather have the outcome of a complete failure and nothing happening in a lot of cases, probably the majority of cases. So it's just like exciting for the whole table every time
Yeah.
it happens from the first turn of the game, right? This could be the first thing you do, and you're immediately like, all right, who's like risking it here and who's going to be more cautious. Like you're kind of setting the tone from the jump with this, and I think that's really fun and exciting. So Brendan, can I tell you how it works in Beowulf the Legend?
Yeah.
Okay, so in Beowulf the Legend, all of the risk events are exactly the same. So in Ego, sometimes you're flipping 2 cards, sometimes you're flipping 4. In Beowulf, always flipping 2. A success is matching 1 or both, and you just get those cards into your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's in a negotiation style event, you don't have to play it in Beowulf like you do in Ego. And a
Mm.
failure is no cards match, and you you don't get any cards, obviously, and you take the penalty.
Okay. Which is usually scratches, probably.
Always a scratch in this
Always
case.
one scratch in this
Yeah.
case. Okay.
Right. So it means that like you
Wow.
always like totally succeed or totally fail. There's no middle ground at all.
It's a less nuanced decision point.
It's much less no, it's less nuanced for sure. And
Yeah.
the other important thing is like totally failing or succeeding like doesn't knock you out of the auction. So what
Yeah.
can happen in Beowulf, right, is somebody could have their
Mm.
hand totally loaded with cards in that auction and they miss, they're like, whatever, I take a scratch and then I just play my card into the auction
Oh.
anyway. Or they
Ah.
hit two and they're like, cool, I'll play one. So what, like, why I got so mad, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this experience, is like I would have like set up for like a huge, like, collected a bunch of suits that are going to be really good for a key auction, and I'll like go into an auction with 6 cards, and my opponent has like 0 cards in hand, and they'll beat me in the auction because they just risk every time and they're like succeeding. I'm like draining cards out of my hand, and then when it's like finally time for me to risk, I miss, right? Or
Yeah.
or the multiple times I risk, I'm missing every time and they're hitting, and it just felt like, it just sucks. So I think like the fact that like there's a risk to risking when you actually have the cards that you could be playing into it is like makes the decision space like way more nuanced than just like if I, just hit me, basically every time. Especially if I've been like lucky to that point and therefore haven't collected many scratches, like getting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 might be essentially no sweat off my back at all.
Yeah.
So you're just like constantly doing it. So this to me is like a massive, massive improvement in the game. I really think it's like like masterful development by Knizia and Bitewing Games to get to this point. And the reason I say that is because like it still feels exciting. I think the task, Nick Murray did a kind of like a journal on Board Game Geek, and he talks about like the reason he thinks this game hasn't been developed to this point is because like the people who love this game like love the excitement of that risk mechanism, and the people that hate it like don't. So you to like redevelop it in a way that like is going to like
Build a bridge between those two people groups. Yeah.
basically impossible. And I think that they've made this risk mechanism like as accessible as possible to like a as wide of a swath of board game playing people as they can without losing like the excitement and fun of it, because I think that still totally comes through. But having said that, like I don't think there's like that much bridge that can be made. Like,
Yeah.
I think if you hated it in the first iteration of this game, if you played Beowulf, or this that just sounds terrible to you as I describe it, you're not going to probably suddenly love it. It's softened, but it's still the same mechanism at the end of the day. And also, I think at the end of the day, like if a player is getting significantly better outcomes through sheer luck over the course of the game, like they're still gonna be at a huge advantage over a player who's like getting poor luck on those
And if
flips.
this sounds confusing, it's as if you're participating in an auction with the option at this to play a hand of blackjack in the middle to get more money. That's the game. That's pretty much the game.
Right.
And I will say this leads to epic moments where everyone's playing blackjack and everyone's getting the outcome that they want, and all of a sudden the stakes on the table feel huge, though they're not really, because another important thing about ego is that everyone in the auction loses everything they bid. So whether or not if you bid 5 and you lose to someone who bid 6, you're spending all 5 of your generic suit bucks for the privilege of having made that bid. And I think that's something else that could rub people the wrong way, but feels pretty important with this risk mechanism to have a rule like that in there. And I will say, I'm amazed that Ego makes a mechanism in which you're playing an auction in which you do not keep what you bid at the end, which is a pretty important mechanism for positive player experiences across auction games, work as well as it does here. Other key things are the game really drives towards an end that I'm hearing from you, Jake. Beowulf the Legend and its risk mechanism doesn't incentivize as much. Here, there's it will end. There, like the end of risks is in sight, right? In Beowulf the Legend, it just says, look, if you get three or four, if you get more than 3 wounds, you're gonna have a real hard time winning. So it sort of says, hey, you could just make yourself probably lose the game, so don't do that. And here it says, hey, this auction will end, right? Like there's a limit to how much you can push your luck. My wife and I, when we played, had this really epic moment where we each took risks maybe 5 times back and forth. It was exciting in all the ways you would want this mechanism to be exciting, but it did come to a climactic end, which was fun.
Yeah. Also, like you can't really overstate like how much like this seemingly small change like changes the experience of play, because like the vast majority of risks over the course of the game in Ego will be the middle outcome of like you're
Yeah,
matching
yeah, yeah,
some
yeah,
but not all.
yeah,
And there's still like an exciting range within that of like good to bad, right? 3 out of 4 good, 1 out of 4 bad.
yeah.
Whereas like in Beowulf, like 100% of the risks that are taken are either devastating or like amazing.
Right. Yeah,
Right. So
yeah,
yeah, I agree when you say it's less nuanced. So we should probably move on from that and kind of like for the remainder of the episode, Brendan, like talk about the decision space here.
yeah.
And I guess just kind of like general thoughts on like the decisions you're making in this game, why it's fun, why it's not fun.
I'd love to start with us characterizing the decision space like we always do, if that's okay with you. And this
Yeah.
is a tricky one. So oftentimes we like to talk about the shape of a decision space, right? Do your decisions, are you presented with more options? Does it wax throughout the game? Is it an engine building game where you do stuff that lets you do more stuff so you have more decisions to make, more options? Or is it a waning decision space game where you start with lots of options and you narrow down to having very few? Or is it static? Are you always making the same decisions in this game, the exact same decision over and over, something like rock, paper, scissors? Or is it dynamic? Is it ebbing and flowing in sort of an unpredictable way? And the shape of each game is different. And Ego, in my eyes, is absolutely a dynamic decision
Yeah,
space
it
game.
has to be.
Yeah, the tactics cards, which are the money that you're bidding with in these auctions, more or less, you're going to have more or less at different points in the game, and you may choose to make decisions at certain supply events where you're getting more cards, and that's going to increase the options that you have in the auctions. The same is true for a whole host of different things, well, wild cards that you could get, etc. And I think also importantly, just the way that auctions work, at least the negotiation auctions in Ego. There's a simultaneous reveal auction, which actually we should talk about. And I love that it's included here, where your options will change if you have more cards or less, but the negotiation also feels pretty dynamic too. You're really thinking about what other players are doing. You're thinking about how many offense tokens other players have, trying to kind of keep up with the Joneses in a way, right? If everyone has 4 offense tokens, it's not so bad to get one more. But if you
To
have
have
8 and
6.
everyone else has 1,
Yeah,
that
right.
feels bad, right? So yeah, to me, this is absolutely dynamic, and it feels like a dynamic decision space game, right? You feel the sort of ebb and flow of your strength, your potential.
Yeah, I completely agree. Dynamic fits. I think some of the ways that I would characterize it is like there are moments of this game where you're trying to build up a hand, and then there's moments of the game where you're like, it's time to spend like the
Yeah,
resources I've collected. Um, and that pattern will happen multiple times. You'll go through like moments of like building up and moments of spending over the course of the game. So it feels really dynamic in like kind of riding those waves. And then also just by the fact that like I have a hard time thinking of another game that feels dynamic in this other sense of like the game is just a sequence of discrete events
mm,
and they're different. Like there are a lot of games like Reiner Knizia's High Society that is just like an iterative series of auctions,
yep,
but this has like auction, choose a boon to get, then another auction. Now you're gonna take a risk if you want to, like a little mini game over here, and now another auction, and now
yeah.
a different type of auction. So like, can you think of another game that's like laid out in a way that has like different, like discrete events that have their own separate kind of decision space? Like the connective tissue is there of like you're gaining these resources that you'll spend for auctions, but it
I
feels
mean,
unique.
it definitely feels unique. It's easy to see how you get from something like modern art to this, in the sense that modern art has a series of auctions. The type of auctions are decided by players. You're managing a hand of cards in modern art, another Knizia auction game. You're managing a hand of cards here. Um, Modern art is a resource management game in the sense that whoever has the most money at the end wins. So you're trying to manage your money, but it takes all these things and puts it in a fun house and makes it a little bit different. And it feels like Knizia is saying, yeah, it's going to kind of be an auction game, but also at this point you get these things, and at this point you can trade in resources. So you have to think about when you're doing certain things, and the shape of the game and the structure of the game feels quite unique in that way.
Yeah.
And procedural. It's also a procedural game because you're not taking turns. You just all do a instructed thing at a certain point all together, right? Knizia says, now do this. Now take 3 cards. Now draft from a display of 4 cards and take turns. And now do this, right? It's, I don't know. It's interesting. Novel.
It seems like like a space that could be explored more, where you're like just moving on a track, like here are 2 choices, here are 2 choices, here are 2 choices, here are 2 choices or whatever. And then
Yeah.
by the end of the game, players have like created different situations based on the choices they've made thus far and will like choose different things.
Yeah.
It's like kind of that in a sense. And it feels like that's not where a lot of games are at. It's like almost like classic board game, like the game of life, right? It's like, are you going to go up
Mm.
there and go to college and or whatever? But
Yeah.
like but everybody's going through all those and choosing their different things at the same time. The
Yep.
only game, one other game that comes to mind that I think has kind of elements of this that might be an odd one to point out here. But I raise it because I do think it absolutely impacts the decision space here, that you can see the whole path in front of you from the beginning of the game.
Yeah.
Um, and that
It's
one is
important.
Steffenfeld's Year of the Dragon. Does the same
Mm.
thing where you
Yeah.
lay out all the events that you're going to face over the course of the game at the very beginning, and it enables planning. And you can
Yeah.
do the same thing in Ego, where you're like, do I want to spend this card now, or am I going to save it for this auction that's coming up in a couple turns where this could be useful?
Yeah. And by
So you can't really do that in modern art in the same way.
no, a little. Yeah, we shouldn't
It's
talk too much
different.
about modern art. A little
It's
bit, but
different.
it's very different because in modern art, it's more informed by what other players do and when they do it. Whereas here, you can literally look down at the board and say, okay, this suit, persuasion, I need a lot of persuasion early in the game, and it's not going to be very important at the end. So it
Yeah.
emphasizes the resource management decisions and makes that a key part of an even more sort of accentuated part of the game. Do you think at its core, this is a resource management game?
Before you say that, last
Yeah.
thought on just like the board being present is like, we have to say from a decision space perspective, like seeing everything ahead of you definitely increases agency and
Yeah.
skill sealing the game. And it's just an interesting juxtaposition here, because we've talked a lot about like how chaotic and random the systems are.
Yeah.
So to have that paired with just like, here's a ton of information for all the players to like do with what they will at the beginning, creates like, I guess like kind of an interesting tension. It's not something I've seen in a lot of other games.
For me, I think, I mean, this is hypothetical because I have not played Ego with completely randomized events and in order of everything. But for me, it makes it palatable, right? The activity of doing the negotiations and the risk taking and the large uncertainty during those moments. I need the certainty of the board being laid how it is to help ground me in my decision making, to help the game not feel frivolous. And I think that's
Gotcha.
really important from a design perspective, right? It's the backbone of the game.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Sorry. All right. Your question, please.
No, thank you. My question, what was my question? My question was,
I
at its
know.
core, Jake, is this. So I'm hoping we can talk about 2 things. One, I want to talk about clarity, because when we characterize decision spaces, we like to talk about clarity. You just talked about the board, right? Gives you a
That
lot of
a
clarity.
lot of clarity.
You know what's coming, but then you have this immense uncertainty around, will risk succeed or fail? What cards are in other players' hands? When should I spend the resources that I'm spending? What will I even get for the resources that I'm committing for the payoff? In the sense that, what will the how effective will the trade be, right? If I'm spending 1 or 2 of my cards to get a payout that's the best, that's amazing. That usually feels great, right? But if I have to commit 6 or 7 cards, Now I'm in a probably not in a great spot. But then it also just depends on how the risks in that game go and how if the cards are flowing or not, right? There's lots of squish in this game, uncertainty that kind of informs how much things are worth and how you evaluate the payoff of certain things. But then
Yeah.
there's also just like strictly like that's a bad trade.
The thing that comes up for me is like one thing that's very present in playing this game is like the feeling of sunk cost
Yeah.
because like it's one of the few games that has the type of auction, another polarizing mechanic that you spend your money every time you're going around the table. You can only ever increase your bid by one, but that money is spent
Yeah.
at that point. So you could spend three cards and then drop out and still get last, where you should have just dropped out at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Um, and if you're going around the table and now everybody's put three cards, nobody wants to be the person that like gets nothing for their sunk cost, even if that would be wiser than putting four cards down and then
Yeah.
maybe getting second to last or whatever. But it can be so hard because maybe you put that fourth card down and everybody else drops out. You know, as soon as one person drops out, maybe everybody drops out, and then you know win the auction at four. You know, and from going last to first, that's huge. And so, like, I think like especially at higher player counts, like the variable outcomes paired with sunk cost makes it like really opaque, like when you should be getting out of auctions for sure. And I often am like, damn it, dude, like if only I had just not tried to do this. But
Yeah.
now that I'm in it, like I'm not backing down. And I
Yes.
think every player around the table is doing that.
And I
It's
love
probably you probably just like do so well in this game if you're like, I'm not even gonna play in the first three auctions. I'm
yeah.
just gonna hold my cards and let the rest of these suckers like
And then
just
everyone,
spend out.
bids 2 and 1, and then yeah, you're like, oh, if only I committed.
Yeah.
Every decision because of that, right? Because of that sunk cost, every decision point in the auctions, including the risks that you take, etc., feels like a look in the mirror in a way. That's really cool, right? It's sort of forcing you to psychologically grapple with yourself and your decision making in a game that a lot of games aren't playing with the psychology in the same way. And I think that the simultaneous auctions that you do, that's the exact same mechanism, except you can't take risks and you all reveal at the same time. There's no going around the table. You're just revealing once. I think it provides this really cool counterpoint where however much people have committed previously is going to inform obviously how much you can reveal, right? Because you've spent resources so you have fewer, but you've also loosely set this is kind of how much you have to commit to win. And usually you've refueled a little bit between a negotiation where people probably committed a bunch and felt the pain, at least for some of the people around the table, to get something. And I think that my favorite decisions in the game were those. Well, it was taking risks and just like pushing the button. Just push the button. We had this big, fun, climactic moment. That was great. It was just theatrically fun. But then the most interesting decision for me were the 2 times we got to do those simultaneous reveal auctions, because I just got to look at the table, look into my wife Maya's eyes, and play that amazing donkey space of what are we doing here, right? And then we had a good moment where I talked a good game using the language of the game, kind of persuaded, bluffed that I was going to really commit a lot. Played nothing. Maya committed 3, and I felt great. She crushed me, but it was still fun. It was a fun moment. I would like to play it more for even more of those moments.
Do you think one thing we don't often do on this podcast, but I think it's important for this one being like a preview episode? I really like the look of this game and everything. I think the components top notch. Another great production from Bitewing Games. But let's talk about the theme, maybe
Yeah.
to kind of close. Do you feel like this is a thematic game? Or wait, there's one more thing after this we have to talk about too. But
Okay.
the theme.
I I want to follow up on what you're saying, because I agree it's important to talk about the theme, and I want to emphasize what you said about the design and presentation and production, because the card backs in this game are amazing. As someone who is a connoisseur of card backs, Ego is it is S tier. These are amazing card backs. They're so cool. There's power cards and tactics cards. Both have great card backs. I love the look and feel of this game. It's a little busy maybe for the experience that's there. It feels more
Well,
intimidating, but
it
I'm
looks like
yeah, it works great. Yep, 100%. I had to say to Maya, when you sit down, you're going to say, this game looks too complicated, but just stay with me. And too complicated for the space we were trying to fit in. And Maya will play heavy games with me on it, But I just knew she would bounce if she saw the graphic design. We played it for a second. She was like, oh, I get it. It's great.
Yeah.
It reads well. Okay, the actual theme. I don't think the theme serves this game well in any way, shape, or form. It is confusing for me as a player. The suits of cards being the interactions that you're having with extraterrestrials, potentially being gifts or persuasion or intrigue or technology. I just look to the side to read them off of the rulebook because the theme, it's a Knizia game, so the theme is expressed differently than a lot of games. And I think here it recedes rather than pops based on the support that it gets from the presentation. It doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt the game in my eyes, but it's not helping the game in terms of the narrative that comes together, right? When I fail a risk, it doesn't feel dramatic because I failed a risk with an alien. It just, the mechanical, it's a climactic mechanical moment, not a climactic thematic moment.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
we're not like, you and I are not the most like thematic focused
Driven,
people, right?
yeah.
We're like both very mechanically driven. So maybe that speaks to us more than the game. But yeah, I completely agree with you. Like, this could be like spades, clubs, diamonds, and hearts as the suits, right? And it might even be a little more intuitive if it's like this round, it's hearts and spades that matter.
Yep. And maybe during playtesting
Yeah, right.
yeah.
And so yeah, so like I don't know. Like and I think even like using the term negotiation for like an auction probably makes this podcast more confusing to folks than, if we had
Then
kind of stripped that stuff out entirely.
yeah.
Yeah, so it didn't feel particularly thematic in play. I do think like there are like cute thematic tie-ins. Like I like the idea that like the ultimate like the total failure when you don't match any cards is like thematically like you just do something so weird in the presence of aliens that everybody's like, we don't know how to take that, just like go
Yeah.
away.
Yeah, pretty much. It's
Like
great.
which is great. There was like a funny line in the rule book. Did you catch it? Where it's like they talk about like if you winning like going last in auctions is much better. That's like a much more advantageous position because you like the last person in wins, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So
great.
it was funny. Like, so if you win the auction, you have to like go first in the next one. And like in the rule book, it's like talks about that rule and then just like has like a blurb cut out. It's like all ambassadors agree that this is fair.
Yes. See, it's cute. The presentation of the theme, whether it's the surrealist art or even some of the sort of supporting language in the rulebook, is done really well. Just the
Yeah.
thematic hooks into the mechanics of the game itself are not quite there.
Yeah, it doesn't have the agential theme, right? Like you don't
Oh.
feel like when you're
No, you
playing
don't.
this
Yeah.
game, you don't feel like you're an ambassador in space. You feel
Sure
like you're
didn't.
sitting around a card table with your friends playing blackjack.
I feel more like a crocodile playing Zuvadis than I ever do feeling like an ambassador. And I don't feel that much like a crocodile ever playing Zuvadis, but a little bit. Or a marmoset, whatever it feels
Yeah,
like to
hey,
be a
I'm digging my
marmoset.
tunnels, dude. I'm digging my
Yeah,
tunnels.
exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
Okay. You had mentioned one thing at the very beginning in our kind of pre-show for our patrons. I think we should
And
end there.
and say it again. No, go for it. What did I say? What did I say?
You said that Knizia does this thing in games where he has poop suits.
Pretty much. Just that it's. I think there's no charitable way. Okay, there's games right where you just have numerical suits, right? Like something like Lost Cities. Their colors and numbers. It doesn't matter. It's whatever. That's fine. And then there's games like this where it's sort of like we are trying to add meaning to what this card is. It's not a diamond, heart, or spade. It's a gift or it's persuasion. And I think Beowulf Legend does this a little bit too with the suits. Like there's
Yeah, it's
weapons
like,
depicted
oh
on
my
them.
god, dude, don't get me
Yeah,
started
I
on
don't
the
know.
suit. The
Okay,
suit,
okay.
one of the suits is just a fist. So it's like this is the fist suit.
It's
Yeah.
time to punch. But
Yeah.
yeah, I found this distracting because I would look at it and sort of say, okay, What's the negotiation happening with the extraterrestrial here? Oh, I'm having a persuasive technology exchange. Like that works intellectually. I get
Right,
that.
right. Like I'm gonna
But
persuade and give gifts. That's what's gonna work with these people thematically.
totally. But I found it distracting and the suits didn't really feel different enough. I don't know. It just for me I was like, "Oh, I don't know. I want the yeah. Maybe it's this is the one place where the graphic design falls down a little bit. If the suits felt a little more different,
I think that's the thing, right? Like if there was ever like a time that like gifts were
different,
meaningfully different from
it's just
technology or persuasion or whatever.
a
But
slurry of suits.
they're never more different, thematically than a heart from a
Yeah.
spade in Spades.
Yeah. I've been guilty of this, but yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's not a hard knock against the game, but
No. Have you played Taj Mahal, Jake?
I haven't.
Knizia's.
That's on my list. Yeah.
So it shares this auction mechanism a little bit. And they're totally different games, but like collecting cards with the potential for sunk cost. And I will say, I own Taj Mahal, but I've only played it twice. And I think that I like it works better for me in Ego with my one play because of the sort of fast and loose feel and the driving momentum. I think the sunk cost, like losing the cards feels a little bit less bad with the release valve of the potential to just be like, well, just take a risk and who knows how many cards I could get here, you know? I don't know. I think that's a nice little marriage that I want to emphasize, and it's part of what intrigues me about this game. There's a lot that intrigues me about this game. It
Yeah.
is novel and it is interesting. I will say I want to touch on player count, and then maybe you have one more thing. This is a game that plays on the box 2 to 5 players. Mine, I had a good experience at 2. I would play it again at 2. I would much prefer to play with 3, 4, or 5 because
Yeah.
I think the decisions around the negotiations and even the simultaneous choice auctions would become much more interesting and nuanced. They were fine. It worked well enough, but it felt like we were playing something close to the intended game, not quite the game as designed.
I having played it at 4 and also playing Beowulf at 5, I think that's actually one of like the biggest assets of this game is that it is a game that's like great at 5 players, which is
Yeah.
can be rare and difficult.
And quick at 5.
Yeah, exactly. So I can't say that it's best at 5. That'd probably be my like most desired player count if I was to get this back out. I would seek out. It would be most likely to come off myself when I had 5 people around.
Yeah.
I don't think I would play it at 2, just because like having played at 4 and hearing what you're saying, like maybe I'd feel different if you're like, oh, you gotta try it. It was like so cool at 2, but having played at 4, it just feels like you're not gonna. Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't want to
I
go
think
down.
there's
3 even feels like maybe not enough.
Knizia designs that work really well at multiple at I think he's really good at designing games that work great for 2 players or games that work great for 3 or more players, and doesn't have a ton of designs that bridge that divide all that cleanly because he plays a lot with the resource management dynamics of the fuzziness of players' decisions or what are informing the decision space. There's notable and important exceptions. Like Babylonia is just awesome at 2, but that's because he's designed a variant of Babylonia's map that is intended for 2 that works really well there in a way that like Tigris and Euphrates was not designed for and falls down a little bit because you lose the dynamics of 4 players interacting in the same space and get an empty board in return.
And with this one, you're like covering up
Yeah.
potential rewards, right?
Yeah.
At
Yep.
all player counts but 5, where you just have all of them. And I think like it must be so hard to design something that's interesting at both player counts, right? Because like
Both
I mean,
being 2 and 5.
never mind. It makes sense because like as I was talking about that, I realized I was wrong because you could have the best outcome and then like the less good outcome as the next one. You don't have to cascade from best to worst. So you
Yeah.
actually could, and I'm sure they did specifically design the first 2 revealed one to be the ones that would make sense. So in a way, it is designed for 2 players to the best of its ability, but I just think you're not getting the rich texture of the auctions.
Exactly. The dynamics are reduced because of that.
Brendan, I think we've talked a ton about ego after 3 combined plays. What are your final word, closing thoughts for people? Maybe your biggest takeaway of the game, or like what you think people should definitely know before considering backing this
Mm,
Kickstarter.
whoa. Two very different questions there,
Well,
packaged
you
in a
pick or
question
choose. Choose
sandwich.
one. Choose
Pick or
one.
choose. I have to choose one?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. I guess it's a preview episode, which we haven't done before. So I'm gonna take that path, that event. And I will say, if you don't know if ego's for you, even after this conversation, I think that the best thing you could do is to say to yourself, do I have room and time for a game that I'll probably just want to play sometimes, and a game that I can't take too seriously, but is probably going to have exciting moments? And if you have room for a beautifully designed game in your collection like that, or if you're a Knizia enthusiast and you just want a game that feels pretty different than all the games that you've played, even if it's not necessarily a game that is designed pretty differently in a way that anyone's going to emulate probably anytime soon. They certainly haven't in the last 18 years, all that much. Then this is worth your time. It's a cool game. It's definitely worth taking a look at. It's one I enjoy and would like to play more. But if you don't like uncertainty in games, not for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My final thought is this. I've said before on this podcast, I'm sure, that, it's not always best, I think, practice to have a game collection that's filled with only games, only like the best games for most people. It might
Yeah.
actually be more satisfying and useful to you to have a collection full of polarizing games
Mm,
that you can bring out at the right moment when you happen to be in a situation where a game is just going to hit for the people in front of you, even if the vast majority of people maybe don't like it. Um, and I think like for that reason, ego is kind of a slam dunk if you subscribe to that theory. It's not a game. If you own 10 games, maybe you don't want this because it's gonna might be difficult to get out, because a lot of people probably won't like just the swingy and extremely punishing nature of the sunk cost auction combined with this risk taking mechanic. But if you have a bunch of games, you probably don't have one that you can bring out with 5 players that all are like down to have a game that's going to be provide super exciting like stand-up moments, but also moments that will have players like actively upset and like pulling their hair out, and like all within about an hour of time. That feels like a unique game that should fit in a lot of people's collection. So if that's you, I would encourage you to take a look at Ego.
awesome. And with that, we want to say thank you to Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. Thank you to Bitewing Games for the review copy, and Knizia for designing this sweet game. You can find more things Decision Space at decisionspacepodcast.com, like the whole library of all the episodes we've ever recorded, nearing 200 now. You can also find a link to our Patreon there. In our show notes and on that website, decisionspacepodcast.com, you'll find a link to our Discord where you can continue the conversation that Jake and I have started on this episode with us and with other Decision Space listeners like you. We encourage you to do that. Come at us with your questions. Let us know what you think of Beowulf. Pitch us questions about Ego. Jake and I will lend you our thoughts there as well. Coming up, we'll probably cover things like Burgle Bros and Mexica on future episodes, but have a bunch of topical episodes intermingled. And Jake's giving me dagger eyes. I don't know if we'll actually cover Burgle Bros. I'm not sure he's enjoying it.
And if you've listened all the way to the end of the episode, don't forget to give us a review.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
And until next week, thank you so much for listening. And thanks for Hembry for intro and outro music. Reach out. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.